On day 1237 of the war, Trump is preparing to announce an aggressive plan of supply of weapons to Ukraine, says Axios. Rockets of great range cannot enter, which will be able to hit targets deep inside Russia, writes the publication. Lindsey Graham also spoke, who said that Trump is very angry at Putin and that the Kremlin rejected the stretch of U.S. aid. All this sounds, of course, promising, but let's wait for the real actions. The advance of the Russian army has fallen 1.5 times in the past week. In Western media, it is written that the saturation of the front is reduced to no effort by serious breakthroughs. At the same time, it is reported that Putin, in a conversation with Trump on July 3, said that Russia plans to reach the border of the region, which it is written in the Constitution, in the next 60 days. This is an incredible scenario. The Russian armed forces has not reached significant breakthroughs that could provide such a tempo. All this looks like a painful fantasy based on unrealistic ideas about the realities on Earth. Former advisor to the governor of the Kursk region, military blogger Roman Alyakhin, pays attention to the fact that the army of the Russian Federation apparently continues to use unsuitable soldiers after being wounded to draw beautiful figures in the number of soldiers. The Sumy region continues to be pressed and surrounded by Russian troops. The Russian armed forces does not manage to restore the offensive there, while the command of the army of Russia throws in new forces, but this does not help. It also cools the hotheads in the Kupyansk direction. The Russian Zenit Rybari, according to him, is laughing at the publication of situations that do not correspond to reality. But one of the SVO veterans wanted a cheburek, a drunk soldier made a pogrom in Chelyabinsk, threatening with a pistol. But the locals did not appreciate such jokes and threw him straight into the cheburechny. About this and much more in today's fresh summary, which you can support with your like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. All these actions help promote the video, especially your subscriptions. They are important for YouTube algorithms, especially when you subscribe during watching the video or immediately after. Therefore, click on the subscribe button, and who has already done this, thank you very much. Axios writes that Trump will announce an aggressive plan to supply weapons to Ukraine. President Trump will announce a new plan for the armament of Ukraine, which, as expected, will include offensive weapons, according to Axios with a reference to two sources familiar with the plans of the American leader. The sending of offensive weapons will become a serious step for Trump, who until recently tried in every possible way to declare that only defensive weapons would be provided in order to avoid escalating the conflict. American, Ukrainian, and European officials hope that this weapon will change the trajectory of the war and will influence Vladimir Putin's calculations regarding the ceasefire. The plan is likely to include long-range missiles capable of hitting targets in the depths of the Russian territory, including Moscow, are considered by the Axios sources. However, none of them are aware of the final decision. Trump is very angry with Putin. His statement will be very aggressive, said Axios Senator Republican from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham. But this is not the only thing that Graham said. He actually gave a big comment which looks very military, quoting some of his fragments. The turning point in relation to the invasion of Russia into Ukraine is approaching. For several months, President Trump tried to push Putin to peaceful negotiations. He left the door open to Russia, but this door will soon close. Watch out for tomorrow's news. The idea of selling weapons in Ukraine is now being actively discussed. We have already given it a lot, but now there's also an agreement on useful fines, potentially worth trillions. I do not want to rush forward, but there will be a plan for more active use of frozen assets. There will also be a plan for the sale of a large number of weapons to European allies, which can then be sent to Ukraine. Putin calculated he thought that we in Europe would get tired, but NATO has only become stronger and more united. We are on the verge of taking the most severe sanctions in the history of the United States. It will be a real sledgehammer in the hands of Trump. China, India, and Brazil are the main violators. India buys cheap Russian oil and resells it. It's disgusting. I talked to Trump, he said. It's time to act. He tried to persuade Putin to go to the world, but the blows to Ukraine only intensified. Now comes the moment of tough decisions, Trump said. That is, there are several interesting nuances that Israeli war analyst Gal Levin pays attention to and that I find interesting. Here's what he writes. Well, all the masks are removed. Graham literally says that Trump was pulling Putin's hand of help in an unprecedented case, trying to give a chance to get out of this bloody farce at least somehow. But Putin pushed this hand, continuing the aggressive aggression and killing of innocent people. If we absolutely agree that from the very beginning of Trump's new term, the American president tried to help Putin sincerely with all the truths and falsehoods, he was caught in a bloody war where he has no success. The Russian army cannot move forward, and for success he is trying to give. At a couple of popcorns a month and a ridiculous amount of square kilometers on the basis of the effort he has spent. The economy is simply damaged, and as much as there is no skepticism, maybe even in your country, dear viewers, in the background of the fact that in 2022 many believed that the economy of the Russian Federation would end in a couple of months, the figures now very eloquently say that the problems that the Russian budget faced. All non-military industries, the investment climate, never existed on such a scale, these problems as now. Putin loses people, Putin loses international influence. And because of the too large application of efforts in Ukraine, Putin cannot control the international political activities of the era in Syria, Iran, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, not to mention the complete loss of sovereignty of the country and 100% dependence on China. In general, objectively, if we approach the matter without emotions, Putin drove Russia into such a deep ass with a war, the choice of which can only be a miracle. And Trump many times offered this miracle to Putin, but it was not enough for him. This will ruin him, literally greed, literally fryer. It would be stupid to make Trump an ally of Russia, an ally of Ukraine, but apparently Putin did it. Really unique. Here you could start to guess that it is America that is ready to highlight Ukraine. JASSM, Tomahawks, 2,500 Abrams tanks which are put in the desert will never be used, but let's not roll our lips too much. You don't know Trump for the first day, and we can safely assume that all the pious speeches will end in a pshik. Fortunately, it didn't take long to wait. Of the interesting news, Axios reports that Putin announced to Trump about plans to strengthen the offensive in Ukraine in the next 60 days. He did this on July 3. According to Axios, in a conversation with Trump, Putin promised to capture new territories within 2 months before the administrative borders of those regions of Ukraine where Russia has a position. Trump shared these details with President Macron, adding that he wants to take everything. It was after this conversation that Trump began to criticize Putin and agreed to increase the supply of weapons to Ukraine. This can be announced today. If Putin does not try to make a cheap bluff, then he simply broke away from reality, because what the hell are the administrative borders for July-August? Even when the RF army is moving forward, it does it with a turtle's pace and with huge losses, which in the conditions of war on exhaustion are simply impossible to call a success. The Russian offensive is going on since May. Everything is sent to the front alive. There is no talk of the capture of Donetsk, Zaporozhsk, and Kherson regions at all, even in theory. And Luhansk is under the question. Well, the one that has been captured by 99% for 3 years, but the last percentage of the Russian troops is not given in any way. In short, these are some absolutely crazy fantasies that are as far away from reality as possible on Earth. And let's actually look at the weekly advance of the Russian army in Ukraine. Its pace has been reduced by 1.5 times, the agency reported. The Russian military in the last week captured 137 square kilometers in Ukraine. The territory is evidenced by the analysis by the Agency of Data of the close Ukrainian Ministry of Defense of the Deep State project. This is about 1.5 times less than a week earlier. However, the pace of progress remains relatively high, they say. At the beginning of the year, the Russian army only managed to capture a larger territory 3 times in a week. The largest territory of the Russian military in the last week was captured in the east of the Kharkov region, where they advanced to Kupyansk. Under the control of Russia, according to the state, 58 square kilometers have passed here. Stepping in the direction of Pokrovskoe, the Russian army captured 40 square kilometers. Another 27 square kilometers under the control of Russia have passed to the north of the Great New Village. The main battle of this summer turned to the east of Pokrovskoe, on the banks of the river Severny Torek, wrote military analyst Yan Matvey. According to him, in the event of a breakthrough of the Russian military, further to the west they will be able to advance to Pokrovskoe from 2 directions, directly through Myrnograd and bypassing from the north. Russian military at the same time trying to bypass from both sides not only Pokrovsk, but also Kupyansk and Konstantinovka, which can create a threat to the environment, points out the deep state map, writes analysts. The agency Vladimir Putin is convinced that Russia's superiority over the battlefield is growing, and that, on the contrary, Ukraine may collapse in the coming months, reported earlier this week the New York Times with a reference to closed Kremlin sources. But offensive capabilities of both the Russian army and the Ukrainian army are becoming more and more limited due to the large-scale use of UAVs, wrote Wall Street Journal on Sunday. There are so many UAVs now that the pilots attack the military even if they are moving alone. This seriously limits military mobility and contributes to much greater stability of the front line than in the first week of the war, it is said in the publication. Everything that is in the radius of about 20 km from the contact line can now become a target for drones, writes Wall Street Journal. In the conditions of a technological war on exhaustion, neither in Russia nor in Ukraine there are no mobilization reserves and resources for effective offensive operations, wrote in a column for Ukrainian Truth ex-CEO Valery Zaluzhny. Both sides, according to his assessment, may face growing economic difficulties and limitations, their ability to increase and concentrate the potential for large-scale offensive operations. In fact, based on the weekly data, no far-reaching conclusions should be made. I talked about this last week when Russia counted as much as 200 square kilometers per week. It was a high rate of success in Russia, but still incredibly low if Russia wants to capture some areas there. A week ago, I said that if the pace stays the same, then we can make some conclusions. But as you can see, the pace has not stayed the same and has dropped by 1.5 times. From all this, the conclusion is is simple: Russia continues to attack, but it does not lead to serious results, but to high losses, yes. Therefore, I will emphasize once again that Putin is generally distorted and represents reality on the battlefield, and there is nothing close to what he expects. In other words, the US has already stabilized several directions on which the Russian Federation tried to break through, including the Sumy, and the US continues to improve its defensive capabilities. That is, basically on the front, we see a situation in which Russia continues to attack, Ukraine continues to defend itself. There are no serious breakthroughs by Russia. There are local successes, but which are counted by dozens of square kilometers. This is not serious for those ambitions that Vladimir Putin has. This is not positive for Russia at all. And Vladimir Zelensky is absolutely right. He writes that Russia's successes are much lower than those they expect. Russia has been on the offensive for 2 months, May and June, and during this time they were not able to achieve anything significant. Toretsk is still not captured, Chasiv Yar is still not captured, Pokrovsk is not captured. Well, you can, in general, continue as much as you want, but in the best case, at the end of 2 months, if Russia is incredibly lucky, it will be able to take Pokrovsk. But Pokrovsk is not the entire Donetsk region, and there is no serious promotion in the Kherson direction or in the Zaporozhsk direction. Therefore, what has Putin fantasized about there? This is a question that is quite open. Let him fantasize about anything, it's even better. When your opponent, in this case Vladimir Putin, presents himself with a bad situation, he makes bad decisions. Therefore, we will be able to see how the Russian army will act next, which will simply wipe out its troops, because it is now attacking mainly without equipment, which increases losses by times and leads to such a scale of losses, which has not yet been during this war, which we will talk about in a separate video. But before we move on, I will remind you that you can support this channel financially. You can do it on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Go in, choose the level of support, and get some bonuses. There are not so many of them. And I don't have time to do all of this, but basically you support the channel itself and the content that comes out on it, for which you have a giant thank you. Well, you can also buy an VPN. This is a means to bypass blockages, which I do together with the technical team. It allows you to bypass blockages, watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram, go to blocked media. Well, in short, use the internet as you think is necessary and not how the state considers it important to control you. Therefore, VPN is now needed by everyone. If you want a good quality VPN, for which I personally answer, then buy a VPN by the link in the description, and thereby you will support the release of new videos on this channel. Thank you very much for that. There are no oligarchs behind me. The state, what is usually listed there, bankers, who else? I don't know. In short, I have only you, and thank you very much for this. Thank you very much. Well, it is legal to buy VPNs and use them in Russia. If something changes, we will certainly let you know. Well, now let's move on. New York Times journalist went to the Kursk region and published material about the state of the region after the invasion of the Soviet Union. I will not touch on its content because the reporter spent these days in the region together with the Akhmet unit. This is military propaganda of Russia. The problem is not that the publication conveys what is in the Kursk region, but that it is impossible to give out the truth, what is done under full control of Russian military. For example, a journalist comes to a local resident and asks, "What do you have here?" He sees the Amatovs with machine guns behind her back. What do you think these scary people will say? We have already seen how it works without a journalist. The same people say the opposite things depending on who is in front of them. When Ukrainian military is in front of them, they say that Putin is a F***seeking great person. When Russian is in front of them, they say that Ukrainian military is a horror and Russian heroes. The value of such a report is zero, but propaganda for the Russian side is the maximum. People in the Kursk region have gone through a real horror, since war is always a horror. Moreover, Russian soldiers actively covered themselves with civilians as a living shield, which was indicated by the data of objective control of drones, but we discussed this quite a lot with you. I showed and told you the data and facts of what was happening there. And the soldiers of the Russian Federation actively marauded the territory of Kursk without adding calmness. No one denies the suffering of people in the region, but such a report is nothing but the help of the fascist occupation Russian authorities. We don't know whether we are aware of it or not. In the investigations of Russian propaganda efforts, we know for sure that the Russian Federation paid considerable sums to Western journalists and columnists for one or another publication, or look up to $20,000. And recently, columnist Bloomberg, who described how everything was going well with the Russian economy, went to a high position in a Sberbank. It's about the economist Bloomberg Economics, about the Russian Central and Eastern Europe, Alexander Isakov, who went from Sberbank to the position of head of the Center for Macroeconomic Research. So yes, this whole story smells very bad. This is another reason why I urge not to fetishize fetishize Western media. People work there, and people are often weak and unprincipled creatures, sometimes just stupid. That's why New York Times and Bloomberg journalists can be as hypocritical as Alexander Chernik from Commercant or a member of the Red College's award. Look at facts and arguments, not at what label or icon a person is trying to impose on himself. Well, ignore Russian propaganda because it has only one goal: to destroy Ukraine. There is no other goal. And she has companions who sometimes, for their own stupidity, sometimes malicious, sometimes for their own benefits, help her in this. Useful idiots and useful non-idiots who just want to make money. Let's say hello to Bobby Zajev. The SBU has eliminated the murder of Colonel Ivan Voronych. The special operation in search of the murder of the Ukrainian defender was personally led by the head of the SBU, Lieutenant General Vasily Malyak. The FSB-RF agency was sent to Ukraine in advance. 3 days ago, it committed the murder of an SBU employee, they wrote the day before. As a result of conducting silent search and active counterintelligence activities, the enemy's logo was discovered during the detention. They began to resist. There was a fire contact, so the scoundrels were eliminated. I want to remind you that the only prospect of the enemy on the territory of Ukraine is death, noted the head of the SBU, Vasily Malyak. The murder of a Ukrainian defender was committed by two persons, a man and a woman. The curator ordered them to monitor the SBU employees, establish their order for the day and route of movement. Later, the terrorists gave the killer the coordinates of the hiding place, where the gun with the silencer was located. Having committed the murder of the colonel of the security service, the killers tried to lie on the ground. But the SBU officers and the police established their location in the Kiev region. Yesterday morning, a special operation was carried out during which members of the FSB-RF combat group began to resist. Therefore, they were eliminated. It was interesting to observe how Russia immediately turned on in attempts to squeeze at least something useful out of this story. Z channels began to actively tell that, believe it or not, it is impossible to kill terrorists without trial and investigation. In general, they were secretly tortured there, and then the bodies were put in place, and so on. Firstly, it is impossible to read this from Z channels. You can rewind the Crocus period and read what they wrote then and what opinion they had on the work with the terrorists. Secondly, the SBU acted on an absolutely standard protocol for any country in the world. There is a detention. If there is resistance or an attempt to escape, a fire is opened for the purpose. There are photos of bodies of the victims. I will not show them. We are on YouTube, but you will easily find them. There are no traces of torture on them. For me, the border is just torture. That is what there are no reasonable grounds for. Unfortunately, there are no traces of torture on the bodies, and there are no objective data that would indicate. The SBU has come up with something there. And in fact, everything is different. Next to the body of a woman, the hand of the pistol is clearly visible. Therefore, I do not think that Russian propaganda will somehow be able to spread in Ukrainians. Negative attitude to what happened to the SBU. Well, that is, we naturally talk about the saboteurs of the enemy, who killed the SBU staff during the war and who tried to shoot back when they were taken. Second direction of Russian work was aimed at to put a wedge between Ukraine and Azerbaijan so that the victims were citizens of this country. That's why the Encores immediately began a whine, saying that Russia has also killed 2 people and a political confrontation with Baku has begun. And here at least KHNY, but the problem for them is that the situation here does not look like anything at all. In Russia, the security forces came with a raid on people and beat about 50 people, most of whom had nothing to do with those whom the Russian Federation planned to detain. Also, those who were detained were tortured and humiliated. And the 2 were interrogated to death, the case in relation to which the detainees were detained is some kind of a muddled crime that has nothing to do with the war. Well, all this, of course, was accompanied and is still accompanied by an incredible level of xenophobia in the public comments of Russian media, especially about military ones. In Ukraine, a murder of an SBU employee was committed by the saboteurs sent by Russia. They were tried to detain, they were resisted, they were killed. No ethnic or animal beep was found. So I don't think that Russian propaganda is waiting for any success on this track. As for the operation itself, I congratulate the SBU with its successful execution and high reaction speed. I hope that more such operations will not be required, and all the diversions of Russia will be cut at an early stage so that Ukrainian defenders, those who hold the front and those who carry their time in the special services, are not killed by the Kremlin agents. Former advisor to the governor of the Kursk region and the owner of the new Zikir for 6 million rubles, Roman Alyakhin, who has been in office since the meeting, tells why Putin has high expectations and how people in the Russian armed forces are killed for good statistics. Lately, he writes, I often talk to soldiers after serious injuries who have, among other things, amputated a leg. There are examples when a soldier is more than half a year old, he definitely goes to the hospital, but he is not recognized as unfit for service and is not allowed to retire. He has a lot of plans for life, and even I am ready to call, for example, one person on a prosthesis to the firm to teach prosthetics, but no. And, as I understand it, there are a lot of people who are no longer supposed to fight for health, but who have a profession and are ready to come back to work as civilians. Some are even ready to re-enter the SVO as volunteers and help at the front, within the scope of possibilities in the units where the commander is not stupid enough to storm everyone, but is able to deploy by force and competence. Why are they not fired? Is the statistics of the number of fighters important? To what? To deceive the superior. Why should they be overloaded by the hospital or the revolutionary centers? After all, everyone is talking about the lack of workers, but everyone is talking about the heroes. Apparently, it's not for every hero that time has come in Russia, but by choice, writes Oleg. Now, in fact, let's move on to the front. What's going on there? Stubborn fights continue across the perimeter of the encampment of the Russians in the border zone of the Sumy region of Ukraine, writes Konstantin Mashavets. The command of the Kursk army groups trying to expand it at the same time and prevent the departure of its front units. In turn, the front units of the armed forces of Ukraine are actively counterattacking the enemy in the western part of the encampment, practically not only stopping the Russian offensive in this direction, but also achieving its grip and detachment from the flanks. In particular, in the area of Kondratovka, the front units of the 155th OMBRMP and the 30th Anti-tank Regiment of Russian armed forces were probably surrounded by the Ukrainian units. They were surrounded at the same time by attacks from the north and the southeast, from the side of Andriivka, which they had previously repulsed, both in the village itself and in the forest, says Mashavets, and this agrees with what the Z channels wrote recently, which I told you about in the previous reports. Also, the positions of the Russian troops in the Alexandrovka region remain very vulnerable, he continued, where the front units of the Soviet Union also bypassed the positions of the Russians from the east and the northeast. Moreover, they managed to break through into Vanikolyevka. At the moment, apparently the Russian command has introduced its extreme reserves in the direction of Belavoda, Vorchino, and Vitalaga, trying not to allow them to be fully surrounded in Alexivka by counterattacks on the Ukrainian side, Mashavets wrote. Russian activity continues in the city of Vovchansk, he said. In particular, the 128th Front Division of the Separate Fire Brigade of Russia is trying to advance in the area of the oil plant, carrying out several attacking assault actions per day. At present, the Russians have managed to advance less than 100 meters. Well, the command of the 6th General Army, the Russians, and their 1st Tank Army on adjacent flanks also took an active action. The command of Russian armed forces is trying to develop its successes in Kupyansk direction on the square of the army of the North Kupyansk. At the same time, Russia is engaged in persistent battles for the hold of Kondratovka, trying to cover the flank of its forward units, which are breaking through in the vicinity of Kupyansk from the north. The entire perimeter of the Darmoplat, the enemy on the Black Jerbs River, is not only attacked by Russian armed forces, but they have to reflect the quite persistent attempts of Ukrainian armed forces to counterattack, for example, in the direction of the Rydkadub of Katarinovka, where the fights are going on with variable success. Should also be noted, he writes, that so far the task of overthrowing the defense of Ukrainian armed forces on the ridge of the western river Black Jerbs on the areas of Kapenka and Druzhilubovka, the Russian command cannot solve, which in turn complicates its promotion on the wide front and the possibility of flank. Counterattacking actions of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Kupyansk direction, in the meantime, draws the attention of the ZVN blogger Ivar, associated with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. He points out that the real successes in the direction are much more modest than reported by the Russian media. A number of federal media writes that they began to report on the serious successes in the Kupyansk region and the presence of front units of the Russian troops in 1 or 2 kilometers from the city outskirts. At the same time, military analysts, in quotation marks, write that they do not forget to mention the active promotion and attempts to encircle the VSU group in the northern part of the settlement, but rarely overriding the words of the officials. However, reality, as it usually happens, is slightly different, writes Rybar. Which in fact, he describes, the Russian troops actually came close to Kupyansk and are 2 kilometers away from it, in fact, since the beginning of this year, while from the north the front positions of the VSRF separate the administrative border of the city, a few hundred meters only they still need to pass, he notes. However, for a number of reasons, the settlement still continues to be under the confident control of the Ukrainians, and the storm has not yet begun, and the problem of action on the plot raises the question. One of the key problems is the difficult supply, which does not allow a large group to grow on the right bank of the cliff. Coming to the city from the left bank at the moment is also not possible. This is due to both the locality and the rule of the outskirts of Ukraine, as well as the importance of commanding this defense border, in connection with which new units are regularly present at the site as reinforcements, and where there are real successes, writes Rybar, Russian troops continue to expand their position on the right bank of the Oskola River. Since the beginning of the year, 6 settlements have already passed under the control of Russian armed forces at the site. In addition, earlier, as a result of the most difficult battles, it was possible to get closer to the banks of the Oskola River, and on the border of Kryliakovka and Kolesnikovka, thanks to which the front of this site was divided in 2. As a result, the comments of official representatives, disguised as necessary by journalists of the forum, are in fact not connected to the situation on the ground, complains Rybar, and are more likely to be a 7-minute hype than a reliable report to the audience. It is possible to talk about the assault of the city only after the full-fledged fortification of the Russian troops beyond the river, which is what the fighters are currently engaged in reality. At the same time, all the words about the assault of Kupyansk and the real threat of the environment for the grouping of the enemy in it, at least prematurely, as a maximum, disrespectful to the wars that are coming in its vicinity, writes Rybar. What is interesting here is that in general, this is such a trend of the last few weeks that the Z-men are getting more and more cold to themselves. Well, that is, we saw it with you in the Sumy direction, where at first, again, I told you about the fact that the Ukrainians began to counterattack and do it successfully. Then the Z-men began to tell that not everything is so good. Then the Z-men began to talk about the potential environment of the Russian group in the Sumy region, at least in its part. So we saw the same thing in the Severin direction. Again, the Z-men began to write that everything was not as good as the official media describes. Well, now, in the Skupin direction, the same thing. Basically, as we discussed today, we are talking about the fact that Russia has quite limited opportunities to attack. More precisely, Russia throws everything it can throw. The problem is that this does not bring a significant result. In many ways, due to the courage of Ukrainian fighters and the fact that they use drones, which they use as efficiently as possible. There are defensive structures which they build, including the same one in Yegaz, since Russia comes without equipment, just infantry units. Then they get stuck in barbed wire and they can be conveniently, let's say, broken up by Ukrainian drones. In fact, further, as Ukraine increases its capabilities in terms of forming this wall of drones, in terms of striking Russian military industry facilities, in terms of increasing the effectiveness of work within the body system and the interaction of adjacent units within all this, the forces in defense of Ukraine will grow, but the forces in attack in Russia will not grow, because Russia does not have enough technique and resources to use it constantly. At the same time, it still wants to move forward, so it just throws in a large amount of meat, which will die on an industrial scale. And compensating such losses will be quite problematic for Russia. So many say that the offensive that is taking place now is the last offensive for Putin, because the army, the economy, and everything else will be so exhausted after him that there will be no more opportunities for Putin to turn something similar in intensity in this war. Of course, we will not run ahead. It is not a prognosis of what is called investment recommendations, but nevertheless we note the obvious trends that we observe together with you. Well, read about them. After 2 months of Western publications, we usually have the same backlash with you. The lieutenant, outraged by the illegal orders, is preparing for an assault. He was previously taken to the basement for those who had been accused of going to Kursk for a reward. As previously wrote that on June 22, the junior lieutenant Kamil Zaynulin was taken out of the front yard under the pretext of going to Kursk for a reward. It turned out that he was sent to an illegal basement for those who had been accused and refused to serve in the Rasypno-Lugansk region. Since then, he has never returned to the unit. According to his wife Alla, Kamil was later taken to a polygon near Lugansk without a phone in a very worn state. Now, according to his wife, he's being prepared for an assault in one of the 2 units, either in the 22nd or in the 41st Assault Brigade. Zala says the command is right in the face, says the fighters, you will go to the meet. They are also threatened with zeroing out. His phone was taken away. They said that the investigation was going on to check the prosecutor's office. He called me once on someone else's phone. My husband weighed 120 kilograms. Now there are only skulls and bones left. I'm scared to imagine what he experienced there in this basement, she told Astria. According to her words, Kamil was persecuted after he publicly spoke out against illegal battle orders which put them under threat of life of his subordinates. He was accused of abuse of his fellow servicemen, although, in short, it is about collective gatherings for the purchase of equipment and transport, practicable in almost every part. In addition, according to her words, other soldiers, under threat of being sent to the storm, are forced to write a report on Kamil with accusations of abuse, and the fact that he allegedly zeroed out those who refused to pay. She emphasizes that Kamil had nothing to do with any illegal acts of accusation against him, only an excuse for pressure and punishment. He says that while the prosecutor's office is considering the claim, it takes 30 days. Husbands can be zeroed out either on the front line or in another basement. Ola signed up for a personal reception to the representatives of Vladimir Putin on September 26. If he is guilty of something, judge and prove his involvement. After all, we have a legal state, not a court. I want justice for my husband, she says. It was initially known that Zaynulin was sent to an illegal basement in Zaitsevo. However, according to the latest data, he was actually held in Rasypno in the self-proclaimed LPR. This prison is located 15 km from the Zaitsevo basement in the Lugansk region. As Astro reported, often the military are transferred from Zaitsevo to Rasypno and back. In fact, in this story, it is not right to say all, because the Russian fascist military occupant is not pleased with the fact that too many occupying authorities put them on the ground. We wish them bad luck to all countries, and most likely, of course, he is a corpse. Nothing will save him, and let it be an example for you. Let it be an example for you of what is happening to you in the Russian parts. Even if you are the finished, beaten-up scum who really wants to destroy Ukraine and is ready to lick Vladimir Putin's beep, know that they will send you to the flesh, that you will not receive any respect, that absolutely for sure you will fall into a situation where you will receive injuries or you will be killed. They will torture you, your coworkers, they will pull money out of you, and so on and so on. This is what the Russian army is made of. It does not fight with skills, it does not fight with technology, it fights with meat. You are meat, and so run away from there, that there is strength, that there is power, desert, go into captivity. This is your only chance to survive. But of course there are also those who skid, and usually this is, like in the movies, what is called not the best people. For example, here's a representative of the new elite, who killed a 17-year-old girl for 3,000 rubles, a drug addict, went to war and returned. Now he studies in the university and receives awards from the rector. In 1921, in Novosibirsk, the 19-year-old Fedor Kizhin brutally stabbed his 17-year-old girlfriend. He hit her at least 6 times with a knife on her head, face, and hands. All this was done under the influence of the methadone. After the murder, he transferred 3,000 rubles to her card, took her laptop and phone, and ran off to his girlfriend in Kimirova. On the way, he sent photos of the girl to his friends and messages about her murder. "I needed money, I needed a dose," he wrote to his friends. Then he told that he killed her after the interruption because she did not give him money. In August 1922, the court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. Telegram channel noticed that Kizhin is now not only free, but also studying in St. Petersburg in the BGTU of Weinmech. This became known from the publication of the University of 1924 about the meeting of the rector Alexander Shasharin with a student asset. There he awarded Fedor Kizhin as a participant in his contribution and effort to the protection and defense of our country, and his self-confidence and resilience inspire us to new achievements, said in the War Mesh publication. It is not known when exactly Kizhin went to war and was in favor of Putin. However, back in 1923, he appealed for the destruction of the verdict, which the court rejected. Here is another representative of the new elite who walks next to you, studies next to your children, and perhaps looks out for a new girl who he will kill for 3,000 rubles. Can people cope? Of course, of course, of course. I absolutely do not think that on all people you need to put a cross. However, when the whole correction is that you sat down for a year and then was sent to kill, killed, and returned, I do not think that this can correct someone. I believe that such a person is dangerous to society. I believe that such a person is dangerous to others. In general, you see a Russian military or someone with, so to speak, military experience initially treat this as a killer. Not because I call you to some kind of moral condemnation, but because this is a matter of your safety. These people are slowly starting to flood Russian cities and villages. These people continue to kill. Moreover, they kill, fall into war again from there, by some kind of wound, return and kill again. And I must say that what we see now is 1% and even less. Is there a lot of marmalade there? 1%. But most likely it is even less than what will happen later. Hundreds of thousands of Russians were sent to war. Hundreds of thousands of Russians were turned into cars that, being beaten, humiliated, and beaten to death, go to mass assault. They are taught to kill. Well, they are taught badly, but nevertheless. They are taught that there are no moral restrictions. They are marauders. They kill civilians. The Russian army, in principle, believes that it is normal to kill civilians. They torture people, beat, and rob. And then they return to your neighbor's staircase. Then they return to institutions, to workplaces, to cities and various institutions. Avoid it as much as possible. These people are dangerous to your health. Well, like for example this case when a drunk participant threatened his gun to visitors of cheburek in Chelyabinsk. The crowd comes, he's not happy there. The participant in the war with Ukraine arranged a real pogrom in cheburek near the main pedestrian street of Chelyabinsk. Local newspaper 74 Ru writes about this, and here you see everything on the screen. Soldier came in, smashed the cafe, waved a gun, threatened visitors and employees, said one of the employees. He was a little drunk, got drunk for some reason. The security came, they asked him to leave, and he began to resist. They put him in the police station. It is known that the man is detained. At the end of the video, you can see how he was beaten to death, but I can't show it to you yet because we are on YouTube, so I won't. But yes, in this particular case, what is called, there were strong men, and I don't know, it seemed to me from the end of the video that these are the men who were sitting behind the tables there. They are some kind of security. Well, maybe security came after. In short, I don't know. But basically, this is what threatens you at any moment of time. You walk with a child, go to the cheburek or some other restaurant. Then a drunk guy comes in with a gun, begins to swing it, begins to, let's say, start a fire, kills people around. Well, this is already such a standard scenario. This is the voice of war that will remain with Russia in any case. The other thing is that if Russia, let's say, changes its vector and its rules so abruptly, then perhaps their socialization, perhaps the actions that will be aimed at removing this idea of hate from society and making it a little safer. Maximum security is still impossible. Well, that is for many years in any case, as it was after Afghanistan. But basically, there are options in which this will not be so monstrous. But now everything is going according to the worst scenario. They tell on TV that veterans are all supposed to be free. They themselves penetrate this thought, start thinking that they are God-chosen. So they come, and in reality it turns out that everyone does not care about them. Someone drinks, someone drugs, they have PTSD, they have aggression, they have a feeling and confidence in their full God-chosenness. And so they start doing what they start. So what can I say? Be careful and avoid everything in military form, whether they move or not, or who you know. If a friend of yours goes to war, or a guy or someone else you know, another person will come back. Most likely not, but if he comes back, it will be a completely different person who will be a direct threat to your life. Okay, you can figure out your own life, but please, if you have children, please, this is no longer your own responsibility. I mean, this responsibility is not only before you, but before the children. There are already so many tragic, monstrous stories that I read, and see how the veteran of his cut the child, threw him out of the window, did something else. This is monstrous. Absolutely do not let them close to children. In no way should you think that exactly you are an exception or exactly the person you think is an exception. This is not the case. This is a threat to your life. Well, Michael Nacke was with you, and see you soon. All the best. Bye.